Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Perry Warehouse. Our program is about to begin. We ask that you take the time now to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Thank you.
So clearly, I don't need to make an introduction. I'm Bill Berkwhite, the director of Perry Worldhouse, and welcome to what will be really an extraordinary conversation at a moment that truly couldn't be more timely. Our guest today is a man who, in this moment, needs no introduction. You probably saw him on CBS 5 minutes ago and on NBC as soon as we're done. He is also the man who, in my personal opinion, is upholding America's democracy at a moment that it is in challenge. Of course, Perry Worldhouse is a nonpartisan institution, and we would certainly welcome others from the House Intelligence Committee to come and share their views. But today we are truly honored to have Congressman Adam Schiff with us. He represents California's 28th District, and throughout his tenure in Congress, he is focused on growing the economy, bolstering national security, strengthening our communities, and helping small business. Today, he is called to a higher challenge, in my view, that is ensuring that our democratic process remains independent and effective. What is this, the State of the Union? You're going to get a lot of applause today. Seriously, Schiff serves as the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and is helping run the investigation of Russian interference with the 2016 elections. Previously, he served as state senator from California's 21st District, and before that in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. He made poor choices as to where to go to school, as he is not a Penn alum, though many in his office are. He went both to Stanford and to Harvard Law School and has 2 children and a wife who aren't with him today, but he is going to join me on stage and share an update on the investigation, and then I will join him for some conversation and open the floor then to all of you. Congressman Schiff, welcome to Penn.
Well, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. I kind of want to leave and come back in, if that's all right. What a treat to join you. I was afraid this meeting might never happen because the first time I was supposed to come, we had a vote that was scheduled on a day with no votes on the tax cut bill, which I thought I probably should be there for. And then the next time I was supposed to be here, we had a vote on the shutdown, which I also thought I should probably be there for. Today, happily, there's nothing happening. If you see one of my staff from Penn come rushing up with a little note, it probably means the memo has been released, but I promise I'm not going anywhere. What a thrill to be on campus and have a chance to talk with you today. I have really been looking forward to this. The difficult thing about speaking these days is to know where to begin. So let me just begin by sharing a few thoughts on what I think this Russia business is all about. Why should anybody really care? Because I think that depending on who you're listening to, there are obviously a broad variety of views, but I think even among Democrats there's a tendency to think too narrowly about what this is all about. Now, if you listen to the president, this is all a hoax. It's a witch hunt. We don't really know whether anyone interfered in our election. We don't even know if it was the Russians. It could have been the Chinese. Apparently, that 400-pound fat guy is off the hook because we don't hear about him anymore. But the president would have us believe this is all a hoax. This is just an effort to delegitimize him in the greatest electoral victory of all time, apart from all the others. This negotiator of ours, this tough negotiator, goes to Europe to meet Putin for the first time. And what does he say on the eve of this meeting? He says publicly, we don't really know if the Russians did it. And then he goes into the meeting with Putin, and what does he do? He asks Putin, did you do it? And lest we be skeptical that we could rely on the truth from this former KGB operative, he comes back and assures us that he not only asked Putin whether he did it, he asked him twice. because apparently not even the most hardened of KGB operatives can lie more than once in a row. But even among Democrats, there's a tendency to think this was just about the last election, or maybe slightly more broadly about the next election, or about helping Trump or hurting Hillary, when in reality this was about much more. It's certainly true that the Russians had a favorite in the presidential election, and they had every reason to have a favorite. In Donald Trump, they had someone who during the campaign was speaking disparagingly of NATO, who encouraged Brexit and further dissolution of Europe, who talked about doing away with sanctions on Russia over their invasion of their neighbor, something that we never thought we would see in this century, the remaking of the maps of Europe by dint of military force. In all these ways and many others, he was really a perfect choice. There was really nothing not to like about Donald Trump from the Russian perspective. He held out the potential of being a hugely disruptive force, someone that would strain the alliance that we have with some of our closest partners in Europe. Who was a threat. Vladimir Putin doesn't worry about losing an election. If you're a viable opponent of the Kremlin, you end up either in jail or dead. But what Putin does fear is the power of people to gather in massive numbers and oust even their autocratic rulers. It's why the Arab Spring was so terrifying. It's why the color revolutions were even more terrifying. And when those color revolutions came with such proximity to Russia, they came to Ukraine. That was the greatest threat of all. So someone who was willing to speak out in terms of the democratic aspirations of people around the world is a threat to Putin. This is why, and I don't think this is really adequately recognized, this is a big part of the reason why the Russians went into Syria with both feet. It wasn't just, as people have suggested, they wanted to maintain a military base there or expand a military presence in the region. That's true. But the bigger item they were fighting against in Syria was the idea that you could remove an autocratic ruler by dint of popular opposition, because that's the only real threat to his regime. So they had a clear favorite. But if we think this was just about helping the one candidate and hurting the other, we're missing the far bigger and, in my view, much more important picture, and that is what the Russians were trying to do was sow discord in the United States and undermine our very democracy. And indeed, not just our democracy, but the whole idea of liberal democracy, and not just here, but all around the world. Because what they did here was unique for us. What they did here was novel to us because they threw caution to the winds. They got much more deeply engaged in interfering in American election than they had ever before. But what they did here was not at all unique to Europeans or those in the Caucasus and elsewhere, where the Russians have been doing this for a long time. Now, some of the tools are different. Obviously, the cyber tools were enormously effective, but the Russian efforts to undermine the idea of liberal democracy have been going on for a long time and in multiple countries around the world. All of us in this room have grown up in a world that was ever increasing in its freedoms, with more people living in democratic societies, more people able to express themselves, more people able to practice their faith and associate with whom they would. But we are now at an inflection point where we cannot say that that will be true next year, and we can say with even less confidence that that will be true for the next generation. There is a real ideological struggle going on over the fate of liberal democracy. And it's in this broader context that I think we have to see what the Russians did. Because if we are unaware of what's going on elsewhere, we're not going to prescribe the right response to this. Putin is certainly leading the vanguard of this autocratic movement, but he has many imitators around the world. You see it in the Philippines in Duterte, you see it in Turkey with Erdogan. Turkey is now the leading jailer of journalists in the world. You see it in Egypt with al-Sisi, you see it in Hungary and in Poland, in the Czech Republic and its recent election. you see a rise of authoritarianism all over the world. I think we felt that there was some immutable law of nature that freedoms were ever increasing. As Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Only to find at this moment in history it is not bending towards justice. It is not bending towards democracy, quite the contrary. That is, I think, one of the paramount challenges of our time. And sadly, it's a time when the occupant of the Oval Office is not the least bit a champion for democracy. And in fact, sets a very different example for people around the world. When Trump denigrates the press, the free press, when he calls it the enemy of the people, when he says that media is fake if it's critical or exposes corruption, and it ought to be disregarded, this is a model that others around the world are now following. Even people like Bashar al-Assad are using the language of Donald Trump. And people in Turkey and people in the Philippines, when they don't like the coverage, they say it's fake news. When CNN International airs something exposing corruption in foreign government, they say, we agree with President Trump, CNN is just fake news. And so this is what's at stake. This is a time when America needs to be a vigorous champion of democracy at home and abroad. Now, I made an observation a couple months ago that I thought was completely unremarkable. But it got some attention, and I have to say it surprised me because it seems so self-evident. And what I said was that the threat from without, the threat to our democracy from without, the threat from Russia to our democracy is now far less than the threat from within. And tragically, that is, I think, so plainly the case. There is nothing Russia can do to us that rivals what we are doing to ourselves right now. Russia can't cause us to undermine and discredit the FBI and the Department of Justice. Russia can't persuade us not to believe our own press. Russia can't persuade us to delegitimize our federal judges when they rule a certain way. Only we can do that to ourselves. And what I see going on in the government right now causes me no end of worry about the fate of our democracy. When I was in college, I remember rushing back to my dormitory to see Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. That was a time when there was a common set of objective fact that we could agree on, and we had differing opinions about what to do about it and how to interpret it, but at least we could agree on a certain basis in fact. Then we moved to a model where you had CNN and MSNBC and Fox. People who were conservatives tuned into Fox, people who were liberal tuned into MSNBC, people who weren't sure watched CNN. And people chose the news they wanted to hear. Now, with the democratization of information online, people can live in very specific worlds. People can live in a world where they believe there's a child sex predator ring under a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. They can be surrounded by other people in this bubble where they're exposed to no contrary idea, or if they are, only to ridicule that. On social media, which is now, a few months ago I used to say where young people get their news. Now, actually, it's where most people get their news, on social media. This dynamic may be all the more serious and significant because the way the algorithms work on social media is they're designed to get you to maximize your time on their platform. So Facebook wants you to maximize your time on Facebook, and Twitter wants you to maximize your time on Twitter, and Snapchat the same. And so how do you do that? Well, one way you do that is showing you what you want to see. And in the case of what your friends are up to and whatnot, that can be a wonderful and benign thing. But when it comes to news, if the algorithm is producing only the information it thinks you want to see by what it's been able to data mine of your interests and your political views, then we're becoming even more balkanized, even less exposed to other opinions. Now, we focused on this in the Russia investigation because obviously the Russians made ample use of social media. something we continue to learn about. Twitter only very recently revealed even more accounts that were basically proxies of the Russians. But we can see, for example, on Facebook, so graphically what I was mentioning earlier, the multiple aims of the Russians in their interference in our elections. Because, yes, on Facebook you had the content that was clearly anti-Hillary, and you had the content that was very pro-Trump. But even the bigger quantity of content that was being pushed through social media was just content designed to pit us against each other, to exploit our divisions. So, of course, as you have seen, they parroted Black Lives Matter to try to broaden the racial divide in this country. Fascinatingly, they also trumpeted the Second Amendment. Apparently, the Russians are very big fans of our Second Amendment. They don't particularly want a Second Amendment of their own, but they're really glad that we have one. The Russians would be thrilled if we were doing nothing but killing each other every day, and sadly, we are. But you can see in these new tools and tactics, both opportunities for foreign powers to intervene, but even more worrying is the capacity to simply divide us by balkanizing us, by showing us what we want to see. These are some of the challenges. That, to me, is among the most difficult, because in a nation that rightly venerates its First Amendment, what do you do about that? So these are difficult and momentous challenges. But I have to say, that's no excuse for not meeting them. People around the world look to us in these times because there's nowhere else to turn. And much as my colleagues in the other party have given the idea of America as the indispensable nation a bad name, we really are indispensable. There is no other nation that can do what we do. People in the Philippines that are the victims of this campaign of mass extrajudicial killing, they look to us. The journalists in prison in Turkey, they look to us. People that were secular opponents of the regime in Turkey who are still in custody or in fear of going to jail, they look to us. All over the world, they still look to us, and at the moment, they don't recognize what they see. And as long as that is the case in our Oval Office, as long as the values that have come to personify our country are not exhibited in the Oval Office, it falls on all the rest of us to make sure that we exhibit them. I'll end before going to your questions with an anecdote. Last year, I traveled to Munich with John McCain. I love traveling with John McCain. He's a genuine hero and a very courageous human being. I'm set to go back to Munich with him next month, and I hope that he feels well enough to go. One of the wonderful things about traveling with John McCain is that he can invite anyone he wants to dinner, and they usually come. So he invited Bill Gates and Bono to come to dinner. This is not my usual dinner company. And I should tell you that I have an issue with Bono, because I don't think single person should have that much talent. It's just not fair. And by definition, it means there's that much less for the rest of us. But he is obviously a phenomenal musician. He's an incredible philanthropist. I don't know any single person in the entertainment industry who's done more for the world than he has. He's the real deal. But he also speaks like a poet. And during this dinner, after we had our more serious conversation and it was getting late, people started telling jokes. He told a joke about being Irish. And then he got very serious and he said, I'm very proud to be Irish and I'm very proud of Ireland. But Ireland, like most countries, is just a country. America is also an idea. And the minute he said it, I realized that this is what is at risk right now, the very idea of America. And that has been such a powerful and positive idea. It is worth fighting for and cherishing. And I think we all have a job to do right now. As long as we face this crisis in governance, we all have to figure out what we can do in our public office, in our private life, in our corporate life, What can we do right now when the country really needs us? That is our task. And it's wonderful to come here and to meet these wonderful and bright and idealistic young people who are going to rescue us from ourselves and hold so much promise for the future, because they are leading the way. They're becoming active like never before, like no other young generation before. They are not only asking themselves what they can do when the country needs us, but they are doing it. And it's a great thrill to be here and be among them. Thank you very much.
Give you some water here as well, even though we've got your... So, Adam, thanks so much for being with us today, particularly given everything that's going on in Washington. And we'll get to the news of the day. But I want to start with a comment that you made about the fact that we're in an inflection point in the fate of liberal democracy. And specifically, I'm hoping you can share with us sort of your perceptions of why foreign interference in America's democratic process is so troubling, and what's different about what we're seeing here than, say, when the United States has been involved in either monitoring or sometimes even trying to influence elections around the world. Why is what's happening right now so dangerous to liberal democracy in America and around the world?
Well, you know, there's certainly periods of U.S. history that we can't look back on with pride in terms of our interference in the affairs of others. I hope we have put those days behind us, but that's obviously something that we have to be ever vigilant about. What makes the current interference so pernicious is that it can be so pervasive and at the same time completely deniable. The cyber weapon, whether it's for the purpose of influencing elections or the purpose of criminal activity, or in the case of North Korea, attacking a U.S. company, will always have a level of deniability. When the North Koreans attacked Sony, there was a big debate within the administration about what ought to be done about it. And my feeling at the time was that we needed to establish a deterrent, or we were going to see a lot more of this. Now, the minute the administration attributed this conduct to North Korean, many people said, well, what's your proof? And the problem, of course, is that the intelligence community is never going to want to show how it knows who did what, or your adversaries are going to be able to better hide their activity. So there's always going to be a level of deniability. And it's practically a free way to attack another country because the cost of a cyber attack is de minimis compared to the damage that it can do. So we need to somehow establish a deterrent. Now, you might remember at the time of the North Korean attack that the lights went out in Pyongyang. And people wondered, was this our cyber response? Well, if you can't tell whether the cyber response is not particularly effective, and unfortunately or fortunately, the lights are always going out in Pyongyang. My recommendation at the time was a cyber attack doesn't always need to have a cyber response. And in fact, getting in a cyber tit for tat with North Korea may not be a very good idea, because while our capabilities are far greater, our vulnerability is also far greater. What I urged in that case was, what really gets the North Koreans' attention is when you broadcast information about how terrible their regime is. This is what the South Koreans do when they're attacked even with artillery. And so, you know, my feeling was use information as a response and make Kim Jong-un have to do the equation of when he's thinking about a subsequent attack, do I really want to invite what happened the last time? Now, I don't think we had really any kind of response to the North Korean attack. And I think others, including the Russians, watched the lack of response to North Korea and decided that, you know, we weren't going to really respond to a cyber attack on our democracy. And when the Russians first began what they were doing, I think it looked to us as if this was what we had seen in the past, and that is a cyber intelligence gathering operation. But at some point, a decision was made to weaponize the data that they had obtained. Now, part of what we're looking at in the investigation is trying to determine at what point did the Russians decide to do this. And I can go into some of what we've learned that's within the public realm, But the long and the short of it is, because foreign actors now can use this plausibly deniable method, they can interfere in new and profound ways. They can interfere by starting trends on Twitter. They can interfere by pushing out content on Facebook. They can interfere with pushing out content on YouTube as they did, and that's a lesser known way they amplified their anti-Clinton message. They can also do that by committing criminal acts, by hacking into institutions and releasing information. What I was most concerned that the Russians would do, and in fact it doesn't appear they did do, is I was afraid as they were dumping these documents that they were going to dump a false document or a document that in fact was authentic but in which they added additional language in the latter part of the campaign. You can imagine the situation that puts a candidate in. If among 1,000 stolen documents, you include one that is an authentic document, but in which an additional paragraph has been added that indicates illegality on the part of the candidate. There would be no way to disprove that in a matter of days or weeks. And even if you could disprove it in a polarized political environment, who would believe the disproof? That didn't happen as far as we can tell in the last election. There is no guarantee that won't happen in 2018. So the ease of interference and the potentially and hugely consequential impact of that interference is what makes this so different. The best thing that we can do, because there's no cyber fix to this, the Russians are a capable enough adversary where if they want to get into the DNC in 2020, they're going to get in. And if they want to get into the RNC in 2020, they're going to get into there too. The only real defense is to develop a national consensus that if a foreign power interferes in our affairs, we will all reject it. We will all reject it no matter what party it helps and what party it hurts. We didn't have that in the last election. We had a candidate in Donald Trump who celebrated the Russian hacking, who trumpeted every disclosure of stolen emails, who in fact invited the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's emails. That better not be the case in the next presidential election. And of course, the biggest obstacle to getting us to that national consensus is the President of the United States, who continues to suggest that it never happened.
So, Adam, you also said in your remarks that the threat from within is in some ways worse than the threat from without. I'm particularly interested in the interplay of the threat from within and the threat from without. And I know there's things you can't tell us about what you're finding in the investigation, but do you have a sense of whether the Russians ever anticipated that what they did would in some ways tear at the institutions of our very democracy in the way that they have, amplifying the threat from without by, through the threat from within, if you will?
I think the Russians are astounded at just how fragile our democracy turned out to be. That they could poke it with a pin and it would burst the way it has. Mm-hmm. I think they're astounded. I think it's been a catastrophic success for them. This behemoth, this juggernaut of the United States of America, the most powerful democracy on earth, would turn out to be as fragile as it has turned out to be. Now, they're very shrewd about this. Putin is a very shrewd guy. If you look at just some of the events of the last week where the administration has obviously not wanted to sanction Russia. We passed very strong bipartisan legislation, one of the few things, few areas where my GOP colleagues were willing to stand up to the president. And of course, they've refused to follow the dictates of that legislation. Among the requirements was to list oligarchs that are close to Putin that might be the subject of sanctions. So what did they do? 10 minutes till midnight, apparently, before the deadline was due in the legislation, someone in the White House picked up a copy of Forbes magazine and basically, like a pulp fiction novel torn from the pages of Forbes, they listed 96 oligarchs, the same 96 that were listed in Forbes. And what was the Russian reaction to this? Well, of course, the Russians could mock it because This was obviously not the product of any thought, except on the part of Forbes. But what does Putin say? He says, this is just an effort to delegitimize the president. Why would people want to delegitimize the president of the United States? Okay, that could have been written by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. He's smart. You know, he knows the way to influence this president is through flattery and to tell the Trumpian narrative of things. And so the Russians are only too gleefully going to play into this, this fight in the country. And they do it in innumerable ways. Through social media, they continue to try to aggravate these divides. And so the only, I guess, difference I have with James Comey's testimony last year, I would have to say, is James Comey said the Russians would be back. In fact, the Russians never left. And they're never going to leave. This is something that we're going to continue to have to deal with. And of course, not just the Russians. This is the other, getting back to your first question, dimension of this problem, and that is, it's too easy and too tempting. We have a rift among the Gulf nations right now, among the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis. And it began with the hacking of a crawler on, I believe it was Al Jazeera, suggesting that someone had said something that in fact they hadn't said that was pro-Iranian. Now that was either the cause of or the pretext for this rift. But are we going to see in the future India become involved in Pakistani elections and Pakistan become involved in Indian elections? Is this going to be a widespread phenomenon? Sadly, the answer is probably yes. So this Pandora's box has been opened. It's going to be a global challenge and not something that we alone are going to be confronting.
Well, you mentioned Putin being shrewd. I'm flying to Moscow in 3 hours, and we're going to see if my visa is still valid when I land after this conversation.
When you're in the shower, wave hello to the camera. That's all I'm going to recommend.
I can't not ask the question of the day. Last night, you wrote a rather no-holds-barred letter regarding the dueling memos. The Republican memo that, in a party-line vote, the Intelligence Committee voted to release, that's now with President Trump, that may have been altered or doctored. I guess I'm wondering if you can tell us, first of all, why are you so concerned about this memo's release? Is the substance of the memo right beyond the doctoring? And why can the Democratic memo not come out? And should we care, or is this all a smokescreen to obscure what's really going on?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's helpful to view this in context. On March 20th, we had the kickoff of our Russia investigation with an open hearing with James Comey. At that hearing, James Comey revealed publicly for the first time that since July of the election year, there had been an open counterintelligence investigation involving people associated with the Trump campaign and Russia. In that hearing, we laid out why Americans ought to be concerned from what we knew at that point about Russians and the Trump campaign. The GOP considered that hearing, they have since told me, a disaster for them. The White House certainly considered it a disaster for the president. And part of that hearing and others led to ultimately Comey's firing. It was the day after that hearing that our chairman went on what has become known as the Midnight Run, in which he obtained documents from an unknown source that he claimed showed an unmasking conspiracy in the Obama administration. This was an effort to justify the unjustifiable, of course, a tweet by the president that he had been illegally surveilled by the Obama administration. The chairman then went back to the White House and said, I have received these secret materials showing this conspiracy, and it soon became clear that he had obtained the materials from the White House. So the materials he was going to show the White House, he had actually gotten from the White House, and of course they didn't show anything like what he was claiming. From that point on, the effort has been to essentially circle the wagons around the White House, protect the president at all costs, turn the Russia investigation into an effort to protect the president. This latest memo business is very much of the same kind. When I was a prosecutor, the common defense strategy that I would see in cases from time to time was, if the facts are really bad against your client, put the government on trial. So the effort then, with that midnight run, was to put the government on trial. The effort now is to put the government on trial. And the way they're trying to put the government on trial is by suggesting that there is this cabal within the FBI, this secret society, this rampant corruption within FBI and DOJ, and that's the real story. So forget about what the Russians did. Forget about what the Trump campaign did. Ignore the fact that in a matter of mere months, the special counsel has secured the indictments or guilty pleas of 4 people in connection with the Russia probe. And not just any 4 people, and not just for anything, but the National Security Advisor of the United States, who pled guilty to a felony for lying about the Russia investigation. The campaign manager for Donald Trump, the deputy campaign manager for Donald Trump, and one of only 5 foreign policy advisors for the campaign, George Papadopolis. Now, the George Papadopolis guilty plea is very significant because in the factual basis for that plea, Mr. Papadopoulos reveals that in April of the election year, he was approached by the Russians and told, "We have dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of stolen emails." April of 2016, that's before, as far as I can tell, the Clinton campaign was even aware that the Russians had the Clinton or DNC emails. So the Trump campaign is made aware the Russians have dirt on Hillary, and it's really valuable dirt. It's stolen emails. That's in April. A few weeks later, there's an approach made to the Trump campaign at the highest levels that they have dirt on Hillary Clinton. And they would like to meet, and they're going to fly a government attorney out from Moscow to sit down with the Trump campaign. And the meeting takes place under the understanding that what they have to offer is of a highly sensitive nature and part of the Russian government's effort to help Donald Trump. So the president's son and son-in-law and campaign manager go to this meeting on the expectation of dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russian government. And 2 things come out of that meeting. One, the message to Moscow is, we would love to have your help. We would love to have your help, and by the way, late summer is really the best time for us. And the second message is, we're deeply disappointed in the help you gave us at this meeting. Now, the campaign is already on notice. There's a lot more help to be had. Within days of the Trump Tower meeting, Julian Assange announces for the first time he has received the stolen emails. Within days of that meeting. So as this investigation has progressed, as the special counsel has moved closer and closer to the inner circle of the White House, there is a growing sense of alarm within the White House and within Republicans on the Hill. And so you see this escalation of what began with the midnight run, and that is distract, put the government on trial, and so we have the genesis of the memo. So what do we know about the memo? Well, the memo is based on highly classified information. The underlying classified information the chairman never bothered to read. When the memo was brought up in the committee for a vote to make it accessible to members of the House, I asked my Republican colleagues, how many of you have read the underlying material? So you could know whether this is accurate or inaccurate. How many of you have read? It wasn't a single hand that went up. Now, we happen to know from the Department of Justice now there was only one Republican member who read the underlying material, and that was Trey Gowdy, the guy who brought us the endless Benghazi conspiracy theories. But the chairman had not even read the underlying material. And so they draft this memo attacking the FBI and the Department of Justice. I move that we allow the department and the FBI to come in and brief us on this, and they refused. I made a motion that they come in and brief the entire House after they showed their memo to the entire House, and they refused. We now know from the FBI that when they finally got a chance to look at it, that the memo is seriously misleading because it omits very material information and has deep factual inaccuracies. But the point, of course, wasn't to make it accurate. The point was to make it misleading. The point was to selectively declassify information so that it would support a narrative favorable to the president. It's why, of course, the president said he's going to release it sight unseen. 100%, it's going to be released. Don't even need to read it. It's my guy that's offering it. I don't even need to see it. This rule, this obscure rule that lets the House vote to declassify information, has never been used. Never been used. Now, why hasn't it been used? Well, for very good reason. That's not how you declassify information. If you're serious about making sure that you're not revealing sources and methods, if you're serious about not politicizing the intelligence process, when you want something to be public, you put it through a process where the agencies vet the information and they make sure to redact anything that could be a problem. They point out any issues that they might have with accuracy. The GOP wanted none of that. That wasn't the point. So now we have this memo. In terms of what happened after we voted this out of the committee, one of my colleagues, Jim Himes, asked the chairman repeatedly, are we voting on the same memo that's been circulated to the House? Yeah. Well, okay. You know, is this exactly the same memo? And I remember thinking, you know, Jim, why are you asking this question? Of course it's going to be the same memo. I apparently was not nearly cynical enough to imagine that we would either be voting to put something else out completely sight unseen, that no one on the committee had seen, or that we would vote to put out what we had seen, but they would send a different document to the White House. But apparently that's what happened. And so what the White House is considering is not precisely what we voted out. And it just goes to show you the problems when you are doing this for partisan reasons. When you're not willing to be transparent about what you're doing, when you're not willing to even allow the agencies to come in and defend themselves. The way we do oversight is when there's an issue that arises and we wonder, okay, was there a problem here or a problem there? We bring them in and we question them under oath and we demand documents, and all of that is perfectly appropriate. What we don't do is we don't cherry pick classified information and publish it to give the country a misleading impression to protect the president's hide. Now, what's the most nefarious thing about this? What's the most dangerous thing about this in the current context? It's this. The president is looking for a reason to fire Bob Mueller. The president is looking for a reason to fire Rod Rosenstein. The bigger concern I have right now is for Rod Rosenstein. This has been true for me for some time. And why Rod Rosenstein and not Bob Mueller? The White House knows it would face a firestorm if it fired Bob Mueller. What's more effective is to fire Bob Mueller's boss. Now, why is that more effective? Rod Rosenstein decides the scope of Bob Mueller's investigation. Now, I happen to think one of the most important issues that our committee Republicans won't let us investigate is the issue of money laundering. When people think about compromat, what the Russians call compromat, they usually think about the salacious video that's mentioned in the dossier. You know, from my point of view, that's not that compromising for a president like this. I mean, seriously, after Access Hollywood, after, you know, the Stormy Daniels story where an allegation that a porn star had an affair with the now president and paid hush money, barely breaks through the news. How compromising could a salacious video really be? But what would be compromising is if the Trump organization was engaged in money laundering with the Russians. And there have been a number of credible allegations that need to be investigated. At a time when the Trump organization found it very hard to get legitimate financing anywhere, the only bank that was apparently willing to lend them large sums of money was Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank, which recently had to settle with the state of New York and pay hundreds of millions of fines for its role in a massive money laundering scheme on behalf of where? Russia. There was an organized crime and money laundering ring, in fact, operating out of Trump Tower. There are a lot of facts that have been pointed out by public reporting as well as witnesses before our committee about the nature and turnover of transactions at Trump properties. Now, maybe all of this turns out to have an innocent explanation. That's great. Let's find out. What I worry about is anything that has the potential of being used as a lever over the President of the United States. That is a danger to the country. There's an easy way to find out vis-a-vis Deutsche Bank, subpoena Deutsche Bank records. Deutsche Bank has to do due diligence. Let's see what their due diligence had to say. Let's put this to rest one way or another and make sure that there is not a lever over the President of the United States. I mention this because Rod Rosenstein will set the scope for Bob Mueller, saying you can look at this, but you can't look at that. You have this much time, but not this much time. Those conversations are not public conversations. If Rod Rosenstein is fired and someone else takes his place that is a yes man for the president, then they can limit Bob Mueller's investigation in ways we will never see. So that is my concern. What the Republicans in Congress ought to be doing in the exercise of their constitutional responsibilities is not making it easy for the President of the United States to interfere with the administration of justice, but standing up for our system of checks and balances. They ought to be speaking out right now and saying firing Rod Rosenstein or firing Bob Mueller would be an act of obstruction of justice that will bring down this administration. Don't go there. But instead what they're doing is saying the FBI is corrupt, the department is corrupt, and if you fire anybody, we're going to roll over. I think when the chapter in history is written of what we're going through right now, there are going to be a lot of people hanging their heads in shame. I'll tell you one who won't be hanging their head in shame, and someone who's a classmate of mine when I came to the House, and I'm very proud of, and that's Jeff Flake. People denigrate Jeff Flake and say, well, he's doing what he's doing because he was going to lose his election. Jeff is a very bright guy, a person of, I think, great faith that animates what he does in public life, and a very good politician. If Jeff Flake only cared about being reelected, he would be well on the way to reelection. The reason he isn't or wasn't is because during the campaign he spoke out about what we could all see, and that was this man was unfit to be president. And when it became clear and the writing was on the wall that he was nonetheless going to be the nominee and others in his party fell in line, he refused to fall in line. If all he cared about was reelection, he would be well on his way to reelection, but there was something more important to him. And I have to say the most painful realization of the last year for me has not been what kind of President Donald Trump has turned out to be, which I think was sadly predictable, but rather how many members of Congress would be complicit in the undermining of our democracy. That has been a bitter truth to swallow. And it gives me all the more admiration for people like John McCain and people like Jeff Flake, the few people who have spoken out. Last year I remember talking to John McCain and marveling that there wasn't a single member of the House, not a single GOP member who felt they had a constituency to be the John McCain of the House. Why is that? Why is that? I can't explain it. But I think it really ill-serves the country right now.
Adam, I want to ask you two very brief, I hope, follow-ups on the memos and then open it up to the audience. First, the accusations you wrote last night were pretty damning. I'm wondering if, in your view, the chairman should step aside, given that this document has been doctored before it went out. And secondly, if the underlying memos actually show that Rosenstein re-sought a FISA warrant for the surveillance of Carter Page based on inadequate grounds to seek such a warrant, shouldn't the American people know it?
Well, with respect to the chairman, and should he step aside, I thought he already had.
I did too. He seems to be back.
Actually, I knew that he hadn't. I mean, he said that he was going to step aside or recuse himself, but never really did. Throughout this whole time, he continued to make the most consequential decisions in our investigation, which witnesses would be brought in, where subpoenas would go out. The only bank records I can tell you that we have subpoenaed are the bank records for Fusion GPS. So those bank records were willing to go to court, and the majority actually went to court to fight to get those bank records, but it will not issue a subpoena to Deutsche Bank. They want to find out, okay, who's Fusion GPS's clients and whatnot, but they don't want to find out whether there was money laundering involved in the Trump organization. So should he step aside? Yes. He sort of said he was going to do that already, but really didn't. And I think we need someone credible leading the investigation. I've had a good relationship with Mike Conaway of Texas, and notwithstanding all of the twists and turns and turmoil, he and I have been able to work together very well. And in the day-to-day functioning of the investigation, we have worked together very well. But the most consequential decisions are not his, they're Devin Nunes, and therein lies the problem. In terms of the underlying materials, I am at a disadvantage because I can't discuss them. So I can't, at this point, tell you whether they refer to a court proceeding or they don't, or what that might show. The only thing I can say at this point is that I think the FBI is exactly right. This memo is really a spin on not just a set of particular documents, but broader classified information than that, that because of serious and material omissions is inaccurate and gives a very misleading impression, designed to tar the FBI and tar the Department of Justice. And I think it is a violation of the bargain that was made by the Congress in establishing the intelligence committees in the first place. And that is, the bargain was, you share with us, you and the intelligence community, the greatest secrets that you have, and we will be responsible stewards. We will protect your sources and methods, and we won't politicize what you do. Now, the majority has decided to break that bargain. And what that will mean is the intelligence agencies will now not share with us what they used to, because they will feel, and rightfully so, they can't trust the committee with what they do with it. And more than that, sources of information to our intelligence agencies will have to think about whether they're willing to stick out their neck. Because will it mean that when the political winds change, that their information and their identities will no longer be protected? So when the FBI fans out across the country and they're investigating a terrorism case, are Americans going to think, what's your agenda? Are you part of this secret society? Where are you coming from? And how much can I have confidence in what I tell you isn't going to be abused? There is so much hyperbole out there that it's going to cause a lot of Americans to question the very patriotic people who are working to protect the country every day. I've worked with the FBI for 20 or 30 years now, ever since I was an assistant U.S. attorney, and in a sign that all of life basically takes place in cycles. My biggest case was prosecuting an FBI agent for spying for the Russians. But even though I was prosecuting an FBI agent, I worked with 100 FBI agents in the investigation of that case. And I was so impressed with their professionalism. They are the best of the best. And I hate to see them denigrated in this way. It's, I think, enormously destructive. If this was merely doing good oversight, then we would have had them in to explain anything that we had a concern with. We wouldn't necessarily take at face value what they said. We would do an investigation of it, an oversight. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is instead laying a predicate for the administration to interfere with the justice system?
Well, we are a university first and foremost, which means that we have a bunch of students, some of whom are hiding in the back as they came racing in late from their classes. And I want to let the first couple of questions come from students, and then we'll open it up more broadly. So if there's a student in the audience with a question, give us a hand. There's a gentleman right behind the, behind the cameras. Yep.
Thanks. Congressman, I just wanted to follow up on one of your previous comments where you mentioned that the Russians essentially pricked us and they are astounded at how fragile our democracy is. Why do you think that our democracy is fragile in this way?
I think that I think it's because we've become such a polarized society. When Barack Obama first spoke about the Russian intervention in our election, and I was very critical of the Obama administration for not speaking out more forcefully at the time. When he did speak out about it, he was marveling at how the party of Ronald Reagan could tolerate such interference by Russia, of all places. And his conclusion, I think, was really the right one, which was, sadly, we are so divided now that even for the party of Reagan, Russian intervention to a substantial part of that party was okay as long as it was on their side. And I think these divisions are what has made us fragile. I think the Russians recognize that. It's why a lot of their attacks was designed to accentuate these divisions. And it's an easier problem, obviously, to diagnose than it is to cure. There's a lot that's taken place to get us to where we are. Politically, part of the polarization is driven by how we finance campaigns, and in the House by how we have gerrymandered districts. The changing nature of the media, as I mentioned, has also been a contributing force. One thought exercise I often do just to get a sense of the polarization and how people's perspectives now vary so dramatically depending on their political persuasion. Try this thought exercise with me. What do you think the Republicans would say, and I don't mean just the ones in Congress, but many around the country, if it were suddenly disclosed that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice had been having secret conversations with the Russian ambassador designed to undermine the bipartisan policy of the United States and then lied about it to federal authorities? What do you think would be the reaction? What do you think the reaction would be among Republicans if Chelsea Clinton and David Axelrod and I don't know who else were meeting in Clinton campaign headquarters with the Russians, pursuant to an offer by the Russians to provide them dirt on their opponent as part of what was described as the Russian government's effort to help elect Hillary Clinton? What would be the reaction? Would Republicans be saying, there's no evidence of collusion? You know, I find this fascinating that people credibly argue there's no evidence of collusion. Now, the president says this as a mantra. He's a salesperson, and he obviously believes, and not without reason, if he says it enough, maybe people will believe it. There's no collusion, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. I can tell you, if you sought to introduce evidence in court, and the crime, of course, is conspiracy, if you sought to introduce evidence in court that a foreign policy advisor for the Trump campaign, George Papadopolis, was approached by Russians and offered dirt on Hillary Clinton, that the president's son and son-in-law and campaign manager were offered dirt on Hillary Clinton and said they would love to get that help, there's not a judge in the land that would exclude that. They would all consider that evidence of collusion and conspiracy. Now, it's a separate question about whether this meets the standard you would need to prove a crime to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. But I think it's a function of how polarized we are, that what seems so obvious to many, others are willing to completely ignore. Completely ignore. You can imagine the calls about treason if these acts were committed by Democrats. And I think it's useful and constructive and important for us, to try to imagine the shoe on the other foot, and both as a way of identifying hypocrisy, but also as a way of testing our own assumptions about things. Sadly, though, I think it's going to be very hard to get beyond this polarization while we have this president. One of the things I've discovered in this year, as we have all discovered so much about our country and about our institutions, is how much the functioning of our democracy depends on very basic norms of behavior, on having an occupant in the Oval Office with a basic sense of decency. You don't realize how important that is until you don't have it anymore. I didn't feel this way about George W. Bush. I didn't like his policies, but I thought he was a fundamentally decent person. I thought he had respect for our institutions. I have to say I found hilarious Will Ferrell's impersonation the other day. But we've had a series of presidents of both parties who respected our institutions and our system of checks and balances. This is the first that has no appreciation for that, and has a disdain for it. The reporting recently of the president saying, "That's my Justice Department." No, it's not your Justice Department. It's the United States of America's Justice Department. But he seems to either not understand this basic nature of our government, or not care. And to me, that's why I think this is such a great threat to our democracy, and why this is such an important time.
We take one more Penn student. Gentleman in the back there in the blazer.
Hi, thank you. I'm a graduate student at the Wharton School of Business here. So prior to business school, I was working at Stanford University for former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, where we worked on diplomatic engagement with the Russians. And my question for you is, where do you see room for engagement between the United States and Russia right now? And where do you think we should be focusing efforts in terms of discussions and diplomatic engagement? Thank you.
I think one of the most brilliant voices on Russia is Mike McFaul, and I say that not just because he is at Stanford. He's one of the few people, and I know you have them as well, that when you see them on TV, you're like, okay, shh, everybody want to hear this. What Mike was saying from the very beginning of this administration, when the president was talking about wanting to have a different relationship with Russia, I was in complete agreement with, which is, sure, it'd be nice to have a different relationship with Russia. The question is on whose terms and at what cost. If it's going to be on the basis of just what's good for Russia, then obviously it makes no sense. Are there areas where the US and Russia can work together, for example, on counterterrorism? Of course. Are there other areas that we can work on? Yes. Is that likely to happen if both we and the Russians don't come to grips with what they did in our last election, and more significantly, what they continue to do? No. Our interests and the Russian interests have a narrow area of intersection, but from the Russian point of view, it's largely a zero-sum game. What's good for the US is bad for Russia, and what's good for Russia has got to be bad for the United States. Putin has built his reputation on taking down the United States, on a greater role on the world stage at the cost of a lesser role for the United States. Now, even in the worst of times in the Cold War, there were certain things that we were able to work on with the Soviets. Scientific exchanges went on even in the worst of times. And those kind of things should go on even today. But it cannot be based on Russia's interests alone. And too often when I've seen the president talk about wouldn't it be nice to have a good relationship with Russia, it seems to be on Russian terms. Seems to be on the terms of, well, we should do away with the sanctions. We should stop insulting Putin by suggesting they interfered in our election. I mean, the President of the United States, when he was meeting in Asia, it was very clear that he felt he was insulting Putin by bringing this up. That's not the way to change the nature of the relationship with Putin. You know, my feeling, and I took issue with the Obama administration for not being willing to provide defensive weapons to the Ukraine. My feeling is the Russians respect one thing, and it's strength. And we can have a relationship on the basis of strength, not on the basis of either capitulation or in the case of Donald Trump, on the basis of, you say nice things about me, I'll give you whatever you want. So I wouldn't write off the possibility of working together where our interests overlap. It's a fairly narrow area at the moment. But I also feel that to have any kind of productive relationship with Russia, we're going to have to stand up to a lot of their malevolent activity both here and around the world.
We'll open up to the broader community now. Yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have a question on the release of the memo. Aside from Title 10 or any of the US Code, what prevents the Democratic members of your committee from releasing the response memo when something so great is at stake?
Thanks for the question. You know, I had a lot of people ask me, and a lot of people suggest to me, I should just go to the House floor and read this thing. And there are, I think, a couple of compelling reasons not to do that. The first is, this is highly classified information. And in the same way, I didn't want the Republicans to release their memo without having the intelligence agencies and the FBI be able to vet it, to remove anything that might compromise our security. I don't want to have ours released without being vetted. In fact, what I made clear to my committee colleagues is, if they're going to force this issue and publish this spin memo, we want our own memo published to set the record straight. But unlike what the GOP was doing, I was going to want the Department of Justice and FBI to read our memo and make any redactions they feel are necessary, point out any issues they have so that they could be addressed before we made it public. So I wouldn't have any opportunity to do that if I just went to the floor. A number of people have pointed, well, Dianne Feinstein released the transcripts of Glenn Simpson, even though the Republicans said they wouldn't or hadn't agreed to it or whatnot. In that case, it, number one, wasn't classified information. And number two, that committee is not operating under a set of rules. I think Senator Feinstein, as I understand it, proposed a certain set of rules, but the Republicans didn't want to agree to a set of rules to operate under, so there are basically no rules. We are operating under a different no-holds-barred policy, apparently, but we are operating under a set of rules that ostensibly need to be followed. One of the serious issues we took with the alterations the Republicans made to this memo is they're violating their own rules. And moreover, at the same time they were literally arguing for transparency, they were concealing the fact they'd made changes to their memo, even when our own member asked them, have you made changes to the memo? And their answer was no. But I don't think it'd be responsible for me to do this. Now, this brings up a broader point, which is, and I hear this from a lot of folks in my party, these guys are playing no holes barred, tear it down, do whatever it takes. You guys need to do the same thing. And I'm not willing to go there. You know, what I've always viewed as my challenge in politics is to win doing it the right way. Otherwise, what's the point? And so that doesn't mean you're not tenacious in the fight. And I do try to be that.
Let me take the gentleman in the front over here.
First, thank you. I have 25 questions, but I'm going to ask 3. 3 quick ones. First.
Like Rick Perry, I'm not sure I can do all 3.
Congressman Schiff, are you aware whether or not evidence exists that Kushner and Cambridge Analytica and the Russians coordinated where all the internet lies were going to go to which districts and which battleground states. That's question number one. Question number two, you've been asked before, and I detected ambivalence on your part. Why not indict Trump? And third question, besides Flake and McCain, is there any other Republican who you believe has put America first? Thank you.
Okay, well, this will have to be a lightning round if you're going to ask me 3 questions. And my wife says my answers are always too long anyway, and she's right, but I'm going to try to do better. Cambridge Analytica, this is the subject of our investigation, so I'm not really able to comment very much, except to say the way I look at that issue, the way I look at the Russian social media campaign, the data analytics work of the Trump campaign, and whether there was overlap between the two or coordination between the two, is much like you would look at the issue of independent expenditures. Now, we have this fiction created by our Supreme Court that contributions to a candidate could corrupt and therefore can be limited by Congress, but independent expenditures couldn't corrupt and therefore are unlimited. So someone can be limited in giving $5,000 to a candidate, but can spend $5 million on the same ad for the same candidate, and that's not corrupting. But that's the system as it is. So you have these independent expenditure groups that are not allowed to coordinate with the campaign, or it would be considered a contribution to the candidate. But an issue often arises, are they nonetheless coordinating and talking when they're not supposed to? This is how I view the Russian social media campaign. Was there any coordination, or was this truly an independent expenditure by the Russians in our election? So we're investigating that. I can't comment on it. I'm trying to ferret out here what's in the public record, and because I'm not sure, I'm just going to say that's about all I can say. So why can't Bob Mueller indict the president? Bob Mueller could indict the president. In my view, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents the indictment of a sitting president. But I think there are good prudential reasons why he's not likely to indict the president. I'm not sure that Bob Mueller would consider it appropriate to allow 12 jurors somewhere to decide the fate of the republic. Instead, I think if Bob Mueller develops evidence that he believes rises to the level of a criminal referral, he is likely to refer that to the Congress for potential impeachment. That, I think, is the more appropriate remedy. Now, you could, I think, in theory, indict the president, and a court could suspend the trial until after the administration. But I think the more likely course, if evidence were to be sufficient, would be an impeachment referral, not an indictment. In terms of other people who are profiles in courage along the lines of John McCain and Jeff Flake, you know, there are a number of them that are outside the Congress. There are some in the there are some in the Congress at the right time and on the right day will say the right thing, and then they vanish the next day. No one who has been, I think, as consistent as Jeff Flake. But there have been other people who've stuck their neck out who are outside the Congress. I was very moved by an op-ed I read by a prominent Republican evangelical talking about how he could not abide by the mulligan that was being given this president. Now, I think he wrote this op-ed before the mulligan was actually given. But you know, people make those statements not without jeopardy. The people that were the never-Trumpers made those statements, and as a result, they foreclosed an opportunity to serve in the administration. And I think that takes a certain amount of courage, and I appreciate these independent voices. It's very lonely when you're criticizing your own party. Which is, you know, again, why I think Jeff Flake is so exceptional, because the other party seldom cheers for you. Your own party abandons you. And that leaves you in a very lonely place, but that's what profiles in courage are about sometimes. So I hope that more will be inspired by the good examples that are out there. I hope it isn't going to just take something really egregious, something else really egregious by the president, because I know my colleagues are worried about what they see. I have colleagues who do tell me privately, GOP colleagues, thank you for what you're doing, keep it up. Now, they will never say that publicly, but they're deeply worried about what they see going on. Most of them didn't vote for this guy in the primary and think he's been a curse on their party. But they also want to maintain their positions and their majority, and there are a sufficient number who want more than that and are willing to do more than that. And there's some, I think, who just view this as some kind of a game, and you fight for your team regardless of the nature of the game. And I think this is no game. I think this is a very serious time. And I hope that more people will be inspired by Jeff Flake and John McCain and others that have had the courage to speak out.
We're going to, no, I got to cut you off. We're going to stick to the lightning round approach for like perhaps one more question. The woman in the red jacket up front here, and there's a mic coming to you.
Congressman Schiff, I just wanted to let you know how much we appreciate what you are doing, standing in the gap between the masses, standing in the gap between the masses of Americans, some of whom don't even know what you're doing for them, standing in the gap for us and in this country for us to save the democracy. We're so grateful. Thank you.
Hold on.
I could give him.
Do you have a question? All right, we'll take one more question. The gentleman back here with the green shirt on.
Thank you, Congressman.
I think you should have been given more time at the mic,
though. My quick question for you is, are we looking at a new version of the Watergate spin as going all the way up towards the level of the presidency? And do you believe that the Trump loyalty pledge is overjudging the interest of the American people?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part. The Trump
loyalty pledge,
the
is
Trump
it compromising the interests of the American people?
Yes.
Okay. Are we witnessing a slow-moving Watergate? I think we're actually witnessing a very fast-moving Watergate. People forget how long Watergate took. What is most remarkable to me is how short a period of time the special counsel has been at work. Investigations of this size and magnitude don't move this quickly. And in my experience, an investigation of this nature can take years. So what Bob Mueller is doing is moving very, very fast. I wish we in Congress were moving with like dispatch. And much as my GOP colleagues complain, well, Democrats are trying to draw this out. It's not Democrats who are postponing Steve Bannon's testimony or Hope Hicks or Corey Lewandowski or refusing to bring Donald Trump Jr. in to answer questions. It's my GOP colleagues. So I think things are moving actually very quickly. Now, none of us know where this is going to end. And it's hard to escape, though, the feeling that there is another big turn in the road coming. But I have only limited visibility into what the special counsel does. My goal, frankly, is to stay out of his way and make sure what we're doing is not interfering with what he's doing and what the administration is doing is not interfering with what he's doing. But to those who are a bit older than I am, who remember Watergate better than I do, this has a haunting, familiar feeling about it. In terms of the loyalty pledge, the revelation this week that the president asked Rod Rosenstein, "Are you on my team?" To me was an exact echo of his asking James Comey, are you loyal to me? Which was another echo of asking Andy McCabe, who did you vote for? I mean, all of this is a president who feels that the only criteria for office is loyalty to him. Not loyalty to the office, not loyalty to your department, but loyalty to him personally. And that's just not how our system works. I'm very proud, and the director probably will wish I don't say this, but I'm very proud the director is standing up for the Bureau. You know, he looked at what the Department of Justice got as a reward when it said it would be extraordinarily reckless for the Republicans to do this, and the backlash that provoked from the president. And even after that, he said that he had grave concerns over the omissions that made this memo so inaccurate. And you know, those kind of things give me hope. And I do want to end on this note, because I know this time can be quite overwhelming, and there's a tendency to say, okay, it's just too much, I'm going to tune it all out. Just too much. We can't afford for you to tune this out. This is a time, I think, instead to try to figure out, what am I going to do in the next year to make a difference? What do I care the most about that's under attack right now? We've been talking a lot about Russia for obvious reasons, but there's a hollowing out of the State Department going on right now. There's a climate denier at the head of the EPA. The Justice Department, that used to be in the business of protecting minority voting communities and their franchise, is now in the business of disenfranchising minority voting communities. You can go across every department and agency of government and find serious problems. Just pick one of them to make a difference. Don't try to do it all. And I come back to something Bill Clinton once said. There's nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what's right in America. There is an awful lot right in America. We will get through this. We will get through this. But it's going to require all of us to do our part and allow us to look back on this as a short, dark period that our democracy survived. We are resilient, and I'm so encouraged by the millions of people that are becoming active for the first time. That gives me a lot of optimism that we'll get through this. Thank you very much.
So you can imagine that the Congress, we're not going to get you off the stage that easily. You can imagine the congressman has nothing to do this afternoon other than go get an Eagles jersey and a cheesesteak. But we do need to let him go. I think he's going to be on TV live somewhere in about 5 minutes. But Adam, we leave today reassured because of the work you're doing to protect American democracy, reassured because you've given us a little more faith in the institutions. We all need to come back together to give them the resilience to survive a tough period. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for being at Penn.